Hey, and welcome. Tonight, we're stepping into the smallest country in the world, and one of the most mysterious. You've heard of the Pope in white, blessing the crowds from a marble balcony, but just beyond those gilded halls is another man. No crown, no choir, just silence, strategy, and centuries of control. They call him the Black Pope, and some say he holds the true reins of power in the Vatican. This story isn't about saints and sinners in neat categories. It's about influence, soft, patient, and nearly invisible. A hidden command center, a secret vow, a shadow that stretches far beyond Rome. Before we dive in, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy these quiet walks through history's forgotten halls, and let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight? What time is it in your part of the world? Settle in, let the noise fall away, and join me as we uncover the secrets beneath the sanctuary. They call him many things: the superior general, the silent commander. But it is the name whispered in private, often with a hint of fear or awe, that captures the imagination of historians and conspiracy theorists alike: the Black Pope. Not because he stands in opposition to the Pope in white, but because his realm is the shadow, not the spotlight. He does not bless the masses from the balconies of St. Peter's Basilica. He does not preside over grand ceremonies. In fact, most Catholics could not name him or recognize his face. And yet, his presence is felt like a current beneath the marble surface of the Vatican, quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore. Behind the spectacle of Catholicism, beyond the rituals and robes, exists a hidden command structure with no altar and no throne. It is here that the Jesuits operate, bound not only by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but also by a deeper commitment to a single man, the superior general of the Society of Jesus. His is not a power granted by crowds or cardinals. It is one enforced by tradition, intellect, and something far more dangerous: total loyalty. While the Pope may speak to the world, the Black Pope speaks to a network, a disciplined global network that listens, plans, and executes in silence. Few question him, fewer disobey, and almost no one understands how far his influence truly reaches. He is not elected by the faithful or chosen in a dramatic conclave surrounded by smoke and bells. His ascent comes from within, decided by the inner circle of Jesuit leadership behind closed doors. There is no media fanfare, no applause, only a quiet handover of power in a room where every man present understands the weight of the role. The superior general does not govern a country, but he controls an empire of minds, ideas, and missions. From classrooms in New York to refugee shelters in Africa, Jesuits operate in places of both visible need and invisible influence. They train diplomats, advise kings, build elite universities, and enter war zones under the banner of service. But make no mistake, their obedience is not to Rome at large. It is to him. And that distinction, subtle as it may seem, reveals the beginning of a deeper truth. one not found in scripture or sermons, but in whispers between powerful men and unread lines in secret archives. The Black Pope is not a villain in a cloak or a character out of fiction. He is real. And if the papacy represents the heart of Catholicism, then the Jesuit general may well be its unseen brain. That is where our story begins, not in the light of the cathedral, but in the quiet, fortified corridors just beyond its reach. The Vatican may be the world's smallest sovereign state, but within its walls lies a labyrinth of power more complex than many empires. Tourists come for the marble, the frescoes, the grandeur of St. Peter's Dome. They see priests in crimson sashes, Swiss guards in ceremonial armor, and the golden light that pours over the square like blessing itself. But they do not see the other corridors, the quieter ones, the ones without plaques or velvet ropes. Here, decisions are not announced to the faithful. They are whispered in Latin and signed with ink that rarely sees sunlight. One such corridor leads not to the apostolic palace, but to a building known simply as the Curia General. There are no statues here, no throngs of cameras, just a modest door, often passed without a second glance. And yet it is from within this plain structure that the superior general watches, listens, and orchestrates. He is not bound by papal oversight in the way many assume. His power, while ecclesiastical in name, is strategic in function. The Curia General is a headquarters, a listening post, a war room, though no bullets are fired, only ideas. And sometimes those are sharper. What makes this dynamic so strange is its elegance. Nothing here is overt. There are no armies, no legislative councils, no proclamations from balconies. Instead, there are reports, quiet orders, subtle shifts in policy that ripple outward from this quiet center. Every Jesuit school, mission, and operation, from the elite halls of Georgetown to the remote fields of rural India, is connected to this one man. The Black Pope does not govern with fear, he governs with structure. His influence is felt not through threats, but through systems that have been refined for centuries. This is not merely the administration of a religious order, it is the operation of a spiritual intelligence network, one built on education, loyalty, and precise hierarchy. The Jesuits don't need to own land to hold sway over it. They shape thought, nurture alliances, and prepare the next generation of influencers before those young minds ever set foot in parliament or palace. And unlike political movements, Jesuits never age out. Their system renews itself every year, quietly, efficiently, and without public noise. So why, then, do so few know about him? Why does a man who commands tens of thousands across more than 100 countries live in near total anonymity? Because that is the point. The superior general's absence from public life is not accidental. It is the mechanism of his control. When power is seen, it is questioned. But when it hides behind education, mission work, or humanitarian aid, It is allowed to grow unchecked. That is how the Black Pope reigns, without a throne, without a face, and yet his signature, while invisible, is pressed into the very foundation of modern Catholic influence. He does not speak from the pulpit. He speaks through the system, and the system listens. To understand the Black Pope's influence, you must understand the men who follow him, the Jesuits. Not simply priests, not quite monks, and certainly not mere missionaries. The Society of Jesus, as they are formally known, was never meant to be a contemplative order tucked away in silence and solitude. From the beginning, they were designed to move, to go where others would not. Their founder, Ignatius of Loyola, was a wounded soldier before he was a saint. His conversion was not a soft one. He did not trade his sword for a cross in surrender. He reimagined warfare itself. For Ignatius, the Church did not need more holy men. It needed disciplined tacticians, spiritual warriors with steel in their spines and a clear chain of command. The rules he wrote for the Jesuits read less like a monastic rule book and more like a military manual, pages dense with hierarchy, protocols, and obedience. And at the center of it all, above even the Pope, was the superior general. For Ignatius, this man would be the anchor, the general of a global army not bound by territory, but by absolute, unbreakable devotion. What sets the Jesuits apart is not just their intellect, though that alone would make them formidable. It is the way that intellect is shaped, through rigorous formation, sometimes spanning over a decade. Jesuit novices are taught to think, to question, and then to submit. They study philosophy and theology, but also science, politics, and languages. They are fluent not only in prayer, but in diplomacy. When they enter a foreign country, they do not shout their message. They learn the culture, master the customs, and then plant seeds. These seeds take time to grow, but they are enduring. In classrooms and courts, in seminaries and science labs, the Jesuits carve pathways into the deepest veins of influence, and every decision they make, every post they are assigned, loops back to the man in black who commands the order from Rome. That is not speculation, it is structure, and that structure is precise. Their vow of obedience is not symbolic. Jesuits are trained to treat the superior general's command as if it were the voice of God. That is the phrase, not as a suggestion, not with discretion, but as the voice of God. It is an obedience that bypasses personal judgment, replacing it with institutional will. This is not blind loyalty, it is engineered surrender. The Jesuits do not disobey because they have been formed not to. And for centuries, that formation has extended the reach of the Black Pope far beyond Rome. He does not need to raise his voice. He does not need to appear. He gives the order, and somewhere across the world, a door quietly opens or closes. No fanfare, no name on the letter. just movement. That is the Jesuit way. And it is through this method, built not on spectacle but on silence, that the Black Pope commands one of the most influential networks in history. The origins of the Jesuits were forged in the heat of crisis. It was 1540, and the Catholic Church was bleeding. The Protestant Reformation had shaken its foundations, and waves of dissent were spreading across Europe like fire through dry grass. Martin Luther's challenge was not simply theological. It was a direct strike at the authority of Rome, and the Church had no answer that could match the urgency of the threat. Dogma was no longer enough. Sermons, relics, and pageantry had lost their grip on minds once trained to obey without doubt. What the Church needed was not comfort. It needed strategy. It needed men who could operate like soldiers, think like philosophers, and persuade like poets. Enter Ignatius of Loyola, a nobleman turned warrior, turned mystic. After nearly dying in battle, he emerged from his convalescence with a vision, one that saw no contradiction between faith and force. He imagined a new kind of order, one that would not retreat to monasteries but would march into the world, into conflict, into enemy territory, armed not with swords but with something far more effective: clarity, discipline, and conviction. The foundation he laid was nothing short of revolutionary. Where other religious orders emphasized retreat, the Jesuits emphasized engagement. Where others emphasized solitude, the Jesuits emphasized communication, insertion, adaptability. Ignatius gave his men rules, yes, but he also gave them methods. He told them to study the minds of those they sought to convert, to understand the psychology of belief and resistance, to go to the heart of power, not just the edges, and above all, he told them to obey, not just God, not just the Church, but their superior general. This command structure turned the Jesuits into a finely tuned machine. When they moved into a new region, they did not arrive with fanfare. They arrived prepared, speaking the language, aware of the culture, ready to embed themselves into society's most influential veins. Whether it was a royal court, a university, or a remote village, the Jesuits positioned themselves as the quiet advisors, the thoughtful educators, the rational voices in the room. But behind that rationality lay purpose. Behind every mission was a plan, and behind every plan stood one man, the Black Pope. And this is why the Jesuits succeeded where others faltered. They were not beholden to tradition for tradition's sake. They evolved, adapted, transformed. They absorbed the tools of their adversaries, science, literature, law, and turned them to their advantage. While other church figures condemned the Enlightenment, the Jesuits learned from it. They were not afraid of new ideas. They were afraid only of losing control. In that sense, the Society of Jesus became not merely a religious order, but an intellectual strike force. Wherever they went, they established strongholds of influence: schools, seminaries, observatories, publishing houses. institutions that would shape generations. And all of it, from the first lecture in a classroom to the final decision about a covert mission, fed back to Rome, to that one unassuming building near the Vatican where the general resided. Power in silence, faith through structure, influence without visibility. This was the dream of Ignatius, and it became the system through which the Black Pope would operate for centuries to come. The Black Pope does not need to raise a flag to command a presence. His dominion is not marked by territory, but by thought, and those thoughts are guided through institutions. While the Catholic Church dazzled with ritual and spectacle, the Jesuits built something quieter but far more enduring: schools. Not just religious seminaries, but full intellectual arenas that trained lawyers, scientists, politicians, and future kings. From the beginning, education was the key, not as charity, but as strategy. Jesuit schools were not open to all. They were precise in their admissions, deliberate in their teachings, and relentless in their standards. The goal was not simply to produce believers, but to shape decision-makers. People who would go on to wield secular and spiritual power with the Jesuit imprint burned quietly into their thinking. Generations passed through those halls. Some went on to rule nations, others to lead armies, others still to sit behind closed doors at world summits. And while none of them would ever say they served the Black Pope, the truth lingered in their principles, their values, their instincts. That is the genius of the Jesuit method. It does not demand loyalty, it engineers it. Behind each institution was not just a headmaster, but a network, a structure that reported back to the Curia General in Rome. The superior general knew what was being taught, where it was being taught, and why. This was not education in the modern sense. It was formation, a slow, careful shaping of minds toward discipline, persuasion, and resilience. And yet to the public, these schools looked no different from any other Catholic institution. A cross on the wall, a priest at the front of the class, a chapel down the hall. But beneath the surface was something sharper, a curriculum built not only around theology and grammar, but around the art of influence. Jesuits taught their students how to read between lines, how to analyze power structures, how to operate without being seen. In a world where visibility was often a trap, invisibility became the highest skill. And those who passed through Jesuit halls often carried that skill for life. In boardrooms, in courtrooms, and even in pulpits. It was no accident. Jesuits understood early that to shape the future, you must first shape the mind. While empires focused on borders, the Jesuits focused on generations, and that made them far more dangerous. Ideas planted in youth are harder to remove than any occupying army. They take root in habits, in dreams, in the very structure of how someone thinks. And if the Jesuits had any genius, it was this. They knew how to seed loyalty without ever asking for it aloud. The superior general never met most of his global pupils, but his reach extended through every rule book, every uniform, every assigned reading. The Black Pope didn't need to be present. His presence was already embedded in the minds of those shaped by the system. That's how influence survives, not through control, but through construction, not through fear, but through formation. And formation is something that outlasts politics, regimes, and even the passage of time. The modern world likes to believe it has left behind the age of secret rulers. Kings were replaced by presidents, palaces by parliaments, and divine right by democratic vote. But beneath the surface, some figures continue to move through the halls of influence with the same quiet authority that once ruled kingdoms. The superior general is one of them. Few people know his name. Fewer still know his face. And yet, his words shape policies across continents. Unlike the Pope, whose face is known to billions and whose voice echoes across squares and screens, the Black Pope operates in silence. There are no processions for him, no waving from balconies. His absence is by design. To remain invisible is not a weakness. It is a calculated advantage, because power that cannot be seen cannot be easily challenged. The superior general does not need approval from the public. His authority is not drawn from popularity, but from centuries of structure, loyalty, and precise internal governance. He does not rise through charisma, but through selection, chosen by a handful of senior Jesuits who themselves were shaped by the very system he will inherit. This election process is one of the most closed in the Catholic world. There is no white smoke, no global anticipation. The process is internal, deliberate, and deeply strategic. The man chosen must be able to hold together a global web of influence, not just spiritual, but political, academic, and cultural. He must understand not only theology, but geopolitics, psychology, languages, and leadership. The role is not ceremonial. It is operational, and that distinction is crucial. While other religious leaders serve as moral guides, the Black Pope is expected to coordinate real-world actions. He oversees thousands of missions, institutions, and agents, each tied back to him through a complex network of reporting, review, and reassignment. There are very few positions in the world where one individual can move a person from Brazil to Belgium with a single word. The superior general holds that power. And what's more, those moved rarely resist, because their training has taught them not to question the order, but to become the order itself. That is what makes the Jesuit system so effective. It does not rely on coercion, it relies on complete psychological alignment. It is this invisible coordination that causes some to call the Black Pope one of the most powerful unelected figures in the world. Not because he commands armies. He does not. Not because he has wealth beyond comprehension. He likely does not. but because his reach extends into the very frameworks through which nations operate: education, diplomacy, humanitarian work. These are not merely services, they are doorways. And once inside, the Jesuits do not announce themselves. They observe, they understand, and they influence. The Superior General sits at the center of this vast, humming web, issuing quiet decisions that ripple outward across the globe. And while the Pope may bless the faithful from his balcony, the Black Pope shapes the minds of those who lead them. It is an eerie balance, one man in the spotlight, the other in the shadows. But sometimes it is the shadow that moves the light. It is tempting to think of missionaries as harmless, wandering preachers with sandals on their feet and scripture in hand. But the Jesuit missionary is something else entirely. He does not arrive unprepared. He does not speak only of salvation. He arrives fluent in your language, trained in your customs, educated in your literature, and by the time he opens the Bible, he already knows how you think. From the earliest days of the Society of Jesus, the missionary was not simply a man of faith. He was a strategist, a diplomat, and often a linguist. Jesuits were the first Europeans to immerse themselves in the intellectual traditions of Asia, to translate the Confucian classics, to learn Arabic law and Indian philosophy. They were not simply teaching, they were absorbing, and in that act of listening and learning, they became uniquely powerful. They weren't forcing themselves into foreign cultures. They were embedding themselves into the intellectual elite of those cultures, adapting their message to fit, and in many cases becoming indispensable advisors to rulers. It is no wonder that Jesuits were welcomed into courts that had once rejected missionaries as imperial meddlers. Because Jesuits were not perceived as conquerors, they came as minds. But those minds were never independent. A Jesuit could spend decades in a far-flung land, writing books in unfamiliar scripts and speaking local dialects with perfect fluency. Still, he remained tethered to Rome. Every mission reported back, every appointment, every school, every new convert, all of it was tracked, evaluated, and, if necessary, redirected. That connection wasn't casual, it was structural. The Superior General knew which missionaries were succeeding, which were failing, and which might be taking too many liberties with their teachings. If necessary, they could be recalled in silence, their writings revised, their legacies rewritten. No field operation in the Jesuit world exists outside of oversight. And that oversight is not bureaucratic, it is surgical. The Black Pope does not govern through layers of bloated authority. He governs through precision and reach. His missionaries, as brilliant and independent as they may seem, operate like fingertips, each moving on its own, but always directed by the same unseen mind. And so the idea of the missionary changes. No longer is he just a traveler or a preacher. He becomes an instrument of cultural engagement, and in some cases, soft power. The Jesuits didn't need to colonize land. They colonized thought. By teaching mathematics in Chinese courts or advising Mughal emperors on European astronomy, they gained something far more lasting than territory. They gained trust. And trust, once earned, becomes access. And access, once granted, can shape generations. Through every school founded, every letter written, every treaty advised, the Jesuits left their fingerprints, not on empires, but on their heirs. The world remembers the kings and generals, but behind many of them stood a man in black robes with no weapons, only words. Words sharpened by loyalty, training, and the voice of a distant general who needed no title, no balcony, and no applause. Just obedience, just results. There is something unsettling about a man who never appears in public, yet whose influence stretches across continents. The superior general is not a recluse by accident. His invisibility is not a sign of weakness. It is a deliberate strategy, the oldest kind of power, the one that rules from behind the curtain. Unlike the Pope, who must wave to crowds and speak to cameras, the Black Pope operates without ceremony. His face is rarely seen, his voice seldom heard. And that silence becomes part of his presence. He becomes more than a man. He becomes an idea, an invisible intelligence at the center of a global structure. To most of the world, he does not exist in any active sense. There is no moment when he steps into the spotlight, no procession to celebrate his ascension. Yet every Jesuit, from the most senior advisor to the newest novice, knows who he is. They do not need to see him to obey him. His authority is not questioned. It is built into the marrow of the system, and that is why his absence is not a gap. It is a design, one that enhances rather than limits his control. The Jesuit system is unlike anything else in the Catholic Church. Other religious orders may have abbots or provincial leaders, but the Society of Jesus is military in form and function. The superior general holds more consolidated power than perhaps any other clerical figure alive. He is not bound by the same chains that limit a bishop or even a cardinal. He does not need Vatican approval to reassign personnel. He does not ask permission to shift resources. His command is internal, complete, and, in many ways, outside the normal channels of church authority. This independence has long been a source of tension. Popes have praised the Jesuits for their service, their intellect, and their loyalty, but they have also feared their autonomy, their discipline, and their silence because the superior general does not wait for instructions. He issues them, and he does so without announcing them to the world. No press release, no camera crew, just a quiet directive passed from Rome to the furthest reaches of the globe. And that directive is obeyed, not because it is convenient, not because it is debated, but because it comes from the one man who speaks for the order. This silence, this absence from public view, has invited speculation for centuries. Some say the Black Pope is a myth, a boogeyman created by those who fear the unknown. Others point to real historical events. moments when political tides turned mysteriously in favor of Jesuit allies. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, but one thing is certain. In a world where visibility is vulnerability, the Black Pope is protected by his own obscurity. His power flows not from popularity, but from design. And that design is ancient, precise, and still fully operational. The world may watch the white-robed Pope bless the masses from the Vatican balcony. But in the quieter corridors, away from the spotlight, another man reads reports, moves pieces, and continues to guide an empire with no map and no crown, just silence and results. Throughout history, power has always attracted suspicion. And when that power hides behind closed doors, the suspicion turns into fear. The Jesuits have never been free from this shadow. More than 80 countries have expelled them at some point in their history, not because they were missionaries, but because they were seen as something else entirely. Governments feared them, monarchs distrusted them. Even popes at times questioned their reach. But what is it about the Jesuits that provoked such sweeping reactions? They never raised an army. They never ruled territory. Yet they were treated like invaders. Because their influence didn't march through cities, it seeped into minds, into policy, into the thinking of those who made decisions at the highest levels. And when influence cannot be measured, it cannot be controlled. That terrified those in power. Jesuits were not just preaching sermons or teaching Latin. They were advising kings, educating diplomats, shaping future rulers, and they did so quietly, effectively, and without needing recognition. When nations cracked down on corruption or subversion, they often found Jesuit fingerprints on the walls of their own palaces, not in rebellion, but in reasoning. Not in conspiracy, but in counsel, and that perhaps was even more threatening. France, Portugal, Spain, and China all at one point moved to expel the Society of Jesus. In some cases, the accusations were vague. In others, they were brutally specific. The Jesuits, they said, were interfering with royal authority, spreading political doctrines, turning subjects against their sovereigns. Whether these accusations were true is beside the point. What matters is that the Jesuits had made themselves so central, so embedded in the mechanics of power, that even their neutrality could be perceived as influence. They didn't need to conspire in shadows to be seen as dangerous. Simply being present, simply being listened to by those in power, made them a threat. And each time they were expelled, it was never a permanent exile. They always returned. Sometimes under different names, sometimes under the same, but always with the same method. Enter quietly, build trust, influence thought. They were not crushed by force, they adapted, and in doing so they proved what many suspected, that the Jesuits were not merely surviving within history, they were shaping it. And above all of this stood the superior general. When the world turned on the Jesuits, it was his signature that coordinated their retreat. When it opened its gates again, it was his vision that guided their re-entry. He was never at the front. never the target, but he was always directing the movement behind the scenes. The Black Pope did not resist with defiance. He adapted with precision. His strength was not in confrontation, but in endurance. Other figures in history lost power because they relied on visibility. The superior general survived because he relied on loyalty, strategy, and silence. And through centuries of exile and return, scandal and restoration, the one constant has been the order's ability to remain useful, even to those who once feared them. When ideas are sharper than swords, and loyalty runs deeper than borders, then exile becomes a pause, not an end. And the man behind that continuity is the Black Pope. Empires are usually built with armies. They take shape through conquest, with borders drawn in blood and battles carved into the pages of history. But the Jesuit empire was different. It had no banners, no legions, no cities flying its emblem, and yet it stretched farther and endured longer than most of the kingdoms it moved through. It was not an empire of land, but of minds. The Jesuits did not need to raise a flag over a capital. All they needed was a school near the palace, a chapel near the court, or a desk in the corner of a diplomatic chamber. From there, they could do what many generals could not: reshape thought, influence decisions, plant ideas that would bloom not in days or months, but in generations. This was their real battlefield: education, ideology, and intellectual loyalty. And this empire, bound not by territory but by trust, was coordinated from a single point: the desk of the superior general in Rome. The Black Pope did not need maps. His empire was marked not by geography, but by networks of trust, obedience, and influence. What makes this model so enduring is its flexibility. Nations rise and fall, governments change hands, but the human mind remains. Jesuit influence does not depend on who holds political office. It depends on who educates the next generation. That is why the Society of Jesus has always invested heavily in education, not just theological, but scientific, legal, and political. They have taught rulers and revolutionaries, scientists and artists, conservatives and progressives, and they have done so with the same goal: not to control, but to shape. Because shaping thought is far more lasting than wielding authority. A regime can be toppled, a law can be repealed, but an idea, once planted, can echo through centuries. And that is the secret of the Jesuit empire. It exists wherever minds are formed, and it travels invisibly across borders, languages, and ideologies. It has no fixed address, and yet it is always present. This is why the role of the superior general is so powerful, even without formal recognition. He does not command from a throne. He coordinates from a quiet office, reading reports from 5 continents, making decisions that might never be known publicly, but will ripple through education systems, diplomatic initiatives, and spiritual formation for decades. His control is not overt, it is structured. Every Jesuit institution, no matter how remote, is part of a chain, and that chain leads back to Rome. Even in the digital age, when power seems to belong to algorithms and markets, the Jesuits retain their grip, not because they resist change, but because they absorb it. They move with history, not against it, and in doing so, they remain just relevant enough to stay influential, just silent enough to remain unchallenged. This is how you build an empire without borders. You shape the stories people believe, the values they carry, the truths they are willing to die for, and you do it quietly, without needing to be thanked or even remembered. That is the method of the Black Pope. To join the Society of Jesus is not simply to take a vow, it is to step into a transformation, one so intense and deliberate that many do not finish it. Jesuit formation is among the most demanding in the religious world, not just in its length, but in its intent. The goal is not to create passive believers, but living instruments. Men capable of persuasion, of deep intellectual rigor, and most importantly, of total obedience. It begins with what seems ordinary: theological study, philosophical reflection, prayer. But over time, it becomes something else. A system designed not only to build knowledge, but to deconstruct the self. Every assumption, every personal ambition, every instinct toward independence is tested, not for cruelty, but for clarity. The Jesuits believe that only once a man is emptied of his ego can he truly serve the order. And once that happens, he becomes something rare, a mind weaponized by humility, sharpened by intellect, and guided by a chain of command that leads straight to the Black Pope. What separates Jesuit training from other religious paths is how comprehensive it is. A Jesuit novice might study languages one year and be embedded in a hospital the next. He might live in isolation for weeks of spiritual exercises, then be sent to a university for advanced science or economics. This rotation is not random, it is calculated. The order needs its members to be comfortable in any environment. A peasant village, a government office, a laboratory, or a palace. And they must be able to move through those spaces with quiet precision. Jesuits are not taught to dominate a room. They are taught to read it, to assess what it needs, and to become that thing. A teacher, a counselor, a challenger, a comforter. This shape-shifting, this trained empathy is not weakness. It is how influence enters places where force would fail. Jesuit priests are often mistaken for ordinary clergy, but beneath the collar is a highly disciplined mind, one that has been trained for years to adapt, endure, and convince. And all of this training, no matter how global, how diverse, how personal, points in one direction, upward, toward the superior general. Every Jesuit, no matter how accomplished, ultimately answers to one man. This chain of obedience is what gives the society its incredible cohesion. It allows a Jesuit in a distant outpost to make decisions with the confidence that his values align with the order's mission, and it gives the superior general a reach that no ordinary religious leader could dream of. Because he is not just a figurehead, he is the final lens through which the mission is interpreted. That is why the training is so rigorous, because once it is complete, the man who emerges is no longer just a priest. He is a soldier, one whose weapons are knowledge, silence, and loyalty. And when the order is given, he moves. No hesitation, no second guessing, only motion. That is how the Black Pope leads, not through visibility, but through the absolute readiness of those who follow him. To most, the Vatican is a single heart beating at the center of Catholicism, but in truth there are two minds guiding that heart, one visible, one concealed. The Pope in white, adorned in robes and ceremony, stands before the world as the face of the Church. He blesses the crowds, addresses global conflicts, and is often treated as a statesman as much as a spiritual leader. But behind the stage, often without acknowledgement, another mind moves, strategic, silent, and unwavering. The superior general of the Society of Jesus does not wear white, nor does he speak to the press. Yet, within Vatican walls, his influence threads through the offices and chambers like a quiet current. While the Pope inspires devotion, the Black Pope enforces discipline. While the Vatican blesses, the Jesuits plan. And sometimes these two minds agree, other times they diverge. And when they do, history shows that the Jesuit mind often prevails, not through confrontation, but through structure, not through defiance, but through endurance. It is easy to assume that the Pope, as the supreme pontiff, reigns uncontested. But the Church is not a simple pyramid. It is a labyrinth of offices, councils, congregations, and orders, each with its own rules, hierarchy, and internal logic. The Jesuits exist within this complexity, but they do not bow to it. Their allegiance is to their own chain of command. The superior general is not just a manager. He is a commander with the authority to override bishops, reassign missions, and redirect global efforts without consulting the Vatican. And he does so with the confidence of centuries of precedent. While cardinals debate doctrine and protocol, the Jesuits are often several steps ahead, preparing the next generation of thinkers, shaping the conversation before it reaches the pulpit. This is not rebellion. It is something far more effective: parallel governance. The Jesuit order is not trying to topple the Church. It is embedded in its architecture, operating like a second nervous system, one that moves faster, thinks deeper, and adapts more quickly than most other branches. There have been moments in history when this duality became visible, times when Jesuit positions clashed with papal priorities. In those moments, the tension would rise, sometimes to the breaking point. Popes have tried to rein in the Jesuits. Some succeeded briefly, others failed entirely, but the order always returned, often more influential than before, because while the white papacy shines in cycles, the black one remains constant. hidden from the eyes of the faithful but deeply present in the actions of the Church. The Black Pope does not seek fame. His mission is too large for applause. He serves not by decree but by design, and it is this design, centuries in the making, that allows him to shape the Church without ever needing to lead it in name. There are two minds in Rome. One speaks to the world, the other listens and waits. Wherever there is secrecy, there will be suspicion. And when secrecy surrounds a group as intelligent, as mobile, and as disciplined as the Jesuits, that suspicion becomes myth. For centuries, rumors have followed the Society of Jesus like a shadow. Rumors of espionage, of infiltration, of plots woven into the very fabric of global politics. Were Jesuits simply preachers and educators? Or were they something else entirely? Operatives in black robes with hidden agendas? The truth is murky, not because it is necessarily sinister, but because the Jesuits have always operated in the gray zones where faith, politics, and power intersect. They were often welcomed into the most sensitive circles of authority: royal courts, strategic alliances, academic councils. They translated not only languages, but ideas, and they knew how to shape those ideas for the benefit of their mission. It is not difficult to see why their presence raised alarms. Jesuits didn't just teach, they influenced. And influence, when invisible, can feel like control. Stories began to circulate. Jesuit priests overheard secret conversations. Jesuit educators molding the heirs of thrones. Jesuit confessors extracting political confessions in the guise of spiritual direction. Some of these tales were likely exaggerated, but some were not. There are recorded instances of Jesuits advising monarchs on how to manage revolts, wars, or diplomatic disputes. There are letters written in careful hand, suggesting the society had advanced knowledge of key political changes. And always behind this web of movement and conversation was the constant obedience to the superior general. It did not matter where a Jesuit was stationed, Paris, Prague, or Peru. He reported upward, followed orders, and contributed to something larger than any one assignment. That structure, so difficult to track from the outside, looked very much like an intelligence network. And that is what made it dangerous in the eyes of governments. Because how do you monitor a system that never reveals its true shape? These fears reached a peak during the 17th and 18th centuries when multiple European powers launched investigations, crackdowns, and expulsions. Jesuits were accused not of heresy, but of sedition, not of breaking doctrine, but of bending loyalty. Were they loyal to the Church, or to the general, to Rome, or to themselves? The answer, as always, was subtle. Jesuits served the Church, but through the voice of the superior general. And that chain of obedience, so tight and so unwavering, looked less like a spiritual discipline and more like the command hierarchy of a secret organization. Whether or not Jesuits truly toppled governments or manipulated kings remains a matter of interpretation. But what is beyond doubt is this: they were trusted by those in power. They were educated in the tools of strategy, and they operated with a coordination that most governments could only envy. If they were not spies, they were something very close. An order trained not only to save souls, but to read the world as a map of influence. And the hand holding that map was always the same: the Black Pope. There is a room in Rome that few will ever see. Its doors are not gilded, its walls bear no famous frescoes. It does not appear in guidebooks or tour maps, but within it, behind rows of meticulously organized shelves and locked cabinets, lies one of the most powerful collections of information in the world: the internal archives of the Jesuit Order. These are not the Vatican's celebrated codices or illuminated manuscripts meant for preservation and study. These are living documents, field reports from missionaries, confidential assessments of political climates, letters from remote provinces, spiritual case studies, coded communications. It is a library of movement, a ledger of global engagement, and at the center of this quiet, restricted space sits the memory of 5 centuries of Jesuit activity, all carefully reviewed, catalogued, and when necessary, sealed. Some records have never been opened since the day they arrived. Others are updated monthly with fresh intelligence. But all of them feed into the same quiet current: the strategic vision of the superior general. This archive is not a museum, it is a control room. Every Jesuit mission, school, and advisor sends data back to Rome, not necessarily in the cold, modern sense, but in the form of letters, reports, evaluations. How is the mission in West Africa responding to new government pressure? Which university is facing cultural pushback? What trends are emerging among students in Latin America? These questions are not academic. They shape decisions, real ones. Decisions about appointments, alliances, the redirection of resources. The superior general is not an isolated figure. He is fed a constant stream of human intelligence, but the kind that doesn't deal in troop movements or military threats. It deals in ideas, in cultural tides, in shifts in religious belief, educational appetite, political openness. And through these patterns, the general sees the world not as a map of countries, but as a field of influence. Some areas ready for expansion, others requiring retreat. Most people assume archives are dead spaces, places where old ideas are preserved for the sake of history. But the Jesuit archives are different. They are used actively. They serve as a neural system for the order's operations, and they are protected fiercely. Their content is not classified in the legal sense, but it is heavily restricted. Only those with specific permission can access particular files. Even many Jesuits themselves never see more than a fraction of what the archives contain. Because knowledge in the Society of Jesus is both sacred and strategic, it must be given carefully and never in excess. What sits in those files is not simply history. It is a map of the world as seen through the Jesuit lens, a lens shaped by discipline, experience, and a long memory. And every document added to that archive becomes part of a larger picture, one that only the superior general fully understands. That picture does not hang on any wall, but it guides the Jesuits as surely as any compass. It is the secret story of the Church's most enigmatic order, and it is written not in prophecy, but in reports, quietly, faithfully, relentlessly. There are moments in Jesuit history when a phrase surfaces that sparks curiosity far beyond church walls. Special pastoral missions. On paper, these missions sound routine assignments given to Jesuit priests to serve in regions of spiritual need or cultural complexity. But within the order, and especially in communications from the Curia General, the term carries a deeper, more enigmatic meaning. These are not ordinary missionary deployments. They are not part of the predictable rhythms of parish work or classroom teaching. They are initiated directly by the superior general, often bypassing regional oversight. And what makes them so compelling and unsettling to outside observers is their secrecy. The location may be known, the priest may be publicly named, but the true objective is almost never disclosed, not to the public, not even sometimes to local bishops. These missions move under a different authority, and that authority answers only to the Black Pope. Governments have taken notice. There are records of political leaders quietly objecting to the arrival of Jesuits under these assignments, suspecting them of engaging in diplomacy without credentials or gathering information under the guise of spiritual service. And while the Society of Jesus has always denied that these missions involve espionage, the pattern of their deployment raises fair questions. Special pastoral missions are almost always sent into environments undergoing significant transition. Post-conflict zones, politically unstable regions, or areas where new ideologies are taking root. The Jesuit assigned is rarely the fresh-faced novice. He is often seasoned, fluent in multiple languages, educated in law, politics, or regional history. He arrives not just to pray, but to listen, to observe, to report. And though his work may be labeled spiritual, the impact often reaches beyond the sanctuary. Sometimes his presence shifts alliances. Sometimes it opens doors that were once sealed. And always his movements are coordinated through the Curia General. Within the society, there is no debate about the necessity of these missions. They are considered essential. The world changes quickly, and the Jesuits see it as their duty to remain not just informed, but embedded. The Church may send letters. The Jesuits send people. And those people do not ask for approval. They follow orders. This is not seen as disobedience to the broader Church, but as a unique mandate, one that places their loyalty to the general above all else. This is the tension, because to some it looks like strategic deployment. To others it looks like infiltration. The line between service and surveillance blurs. But for the Jesuit assigned, the distinction is irrelevant. He is not there to analyze the ethics of the mission. He is there to complete it. And whether the world understands or not, he knows who sent him, and that knowledge is enough. The term special pastoral mission may never appear in headlines, but within Jesuit corridors, it is a signal that something important is happening, and that the society is already inside it, watching, waiting, moving with care, under the quiet direction of a man who speaks rarely, is seen even less, and yet remains the final voice behind so many steps taken in silence. The Black Pope does not need to act publicly. He sends others, and they do not speak his name. They carry his mission instead. There is a kind of power that does not announce itself. It doesn't need a throne, a crown, or even a signature. It's not found in public titles or applause, but in quiet coordination. Decisions made out of sight, conversations that leave no trace, movements that happen without explanation. The superior general of the Jesuits is a master of this power. He does not give press conferences. He does not publish encyclicals or sit for interviews with world media. In fact, many Catholics around the world have never heard his name. And yet, from his office in Rome, he directs one of the most complex, far-reaching operations in modern history, an organization of influence that spans every continent, penetrates the highest levels of academia and diplomacy, and still maintains a reputation for humility and service. That is the paradox of Jesuit power. It is immense and yet invisible. It does not draw attention. It avoids it. And that very absence is what allows it to operate so freely. The Black Pope's greatest strength is his ability to remain unknown. In a world obsessed with visibility, he thrives on discretion. While other leaders brand themselves, the superior general erases himself from the frame. His identity is always secondary to the order. His words are never casual. His movements are not publicized. But make no mistake, his influence is real. He oversees thousands of priests and educators, hundreds of institutions, and countless missions. He receives reports not from one country, but from many. His role is not symbolic, it is functional, and it touches the deepest workings of the Church and the world beyond it. He reads cultural tides the way others read weather forecasts, and when a shift begins, politically, intellectually, spiritually, he is often already prepared, not to resist it blindly, but to engage it with strategy, to shape it. This is not power in the traditional sense. It is a kind of rain without eyes, unseen but undeniable. In many ways, the absence of the Black Pope from public life protects his reach. Without the burden of celebrity or the constraints of public image, he is free to think like an operator. He acts through others. His orders are spoken once and then carried across the globe by men trained not only in obedience but in foresight. A single directive from Rome might result in a shift in policy in South America, a curriculum change in Asia, or a new strategic alliance in Europe, all without drawing attention to its source. And even if someone traces the change, it will rarely lead back to him, because the superior general is not interested in credit. He is interested in alignment, in results. His presence is not one you see. It is one you feel, often without knowing why. A meeting that was cancelled, a policy that was adjusted, a conversation that never happened, but the effect lingers. That is how you recognize the hand of the Black Pope, not by his name, but by the shape he leaves in the silence after something has moved. Walk through the halls of any Jesuit school and you'll find a familiar rhythm: discipline, scholarship, reflection. But beneath the polished floors and quiet chapels is something more subtle, something deeply embedded in the design. Jesuit education is not merely about imparting knowledge. It is about forming minds that align with the particular worldview. And though the curriculum may change with the times, the intent has never wavered. Jesuit schools were never just places of learning. They were laboratories of influence. Generations of political leaders, judges, scientists, artists, and intellectuals have passed through these halls, often unaware that what they were receiving was more than education. It was formation, a carefully constructed internal framework of values, logic, and obedience. The Jesuits don't just teach you what to think. They teach you how to think. And by the time you leave, the way you interpret the world, question authority, or even define truth itself has been subtly reshaped, not through coercion, through consistency. This is what makes their schools so powerful, and, to some, unsettling. They are not branded with overt dogma. In fact, Jesuit institutions often pride themselves on academic freedom, openness to inquiry, and rigorous debate. But underneath that freedom is a structure, a method. Every student is guided through a sequence of intellectual and spiritual experiences that push them to develop clarity, confidence, and moral responsibility. These are admirable goals, but they are also strategic. Because a person trained to think rigorously and act decisively is a powerful tool, especially when that training includes a deep sense of loyalty to the institution that formed them. The superior general does not personally design the syllabus for each school, but the educational philosophy, the principles that shape every classroom, come from his office. And through this system, he influences not just the church, but the future of entire societies. Jesuit graduates go on to lead nations, corporations, media empires, and many carry with them the mark of their formation, even if they no longer attend Mass. This formation is subtle, but effective. Students aren't told to be loyal to the society. They're not recruited into secret meetings or asked to pledge allegiance. That would be too obvious, too crude. Instead, they are trained to value discipline, purpose, and service, to think in terms of mission, to question but within boundaries. And over time, those boundaries shape a mind that knows how to lead, but also how to obey, not blindly, but strategically. Jesuit education does not produce fanatics. It produces thinkers, and that is what makes it so enduring. Because a thinker shaped by the society becomes a node of influence, someone who can enter any arena, speak any language, and hold his own. But beneath that confidence is a foundation built long ago in quiet classrooms, under the guidance of a system that has one goal: to shape the world through its future leaders. And at the top of that system sits a man who has no need to be present in those classrooms. His reach is already there, in the questions they ask, the books they read, the way they move through the world. That is the legacy of Jesuit formation, and that is the hidden strength of the Black Pope. The most powerful ideas are not shouted. They are whispered in private conversations, behind closed doors, in the space between formal meetings and official announcements. The Jesuits understood this from the beginning. Influence does not require a pulpit, it requires access. And once you have access to power, to minds, to moments of decision, you no longer need to fight for control. You guide it quietly. This is the essence of the Jesuit Whisper Network. A system not of secrets and scandals, but of relationships, forged over decades, sometimes generations, in the very places where choices are made. Jesuits do not need to own newspapers or parliaments. They need only to shape the men who do. And when that shaping is done well, the voice of the society echoes in policies, in philosophies, in the words that leaders speak without ever realizing whose logic they are using. This is not manipulation, it is design. The Jesuits do not wait to react to the world. They form the people who will shape it. That whisper network is not documented in books or charts. You will not find it in org charts or institutional press kits. It moves beneath the surface, in the alumni lists of elite schools, in the old friendships between Jesuit advisors and political figures, in the mentors whose words still echo in the minds of CEOs and diplomats. It exists in the phone calls that are never recorded, in the letters that are never published. A question asked, a recommendation made, a warning shared. No official seal, no demand, just a voice, calm and trusted, nudging the course of events. Jesuits do not need to issue threats. They've spent too long building credibility for that. When a Jesuit speaks, it is with the weight of reputation, not just his own, but of the entire order behind him. And behind that order, the superior general listens. He does not micromanage every conversation, but he sets the tone, he defines the mission, and through that mission, the whispers align. In times of crisis, this network becomes even more vital. A sudden conflict, a diplomatic freeze, a cultural shift. Jesuit voices are often already nearby, present in embassies, in universities, in spiritual advisory roles to heads of state. They do not need to storm the gates. They are already inside the walls, and when they speak, it is rarely with urgency. It is with precision, the kind of voice that suggests consideration, not command. But behind that tone is strategy, always strategy, because each whisper carries with it the world view of the society, one trained to see opportunity in every challenge, to act not with panic, but with purpose. And that purpose is always coordinated, even when it appears casual. That is the brilliance of the Whisper Network. It moves with no obvious center, but the pattern of its influence always points back to the same place. The quiet office in Rome, where the Black Pope, rarely seen and even more rarely quoted, holds a map not of borders, but of people. And through those people, the world shifts, not loudly, but inevitably. If you were to ask most people who leads the Catholic Church, they would answer without hesitation, the Pope. He is the symbol of spiritual authority, the visible heart of a global faith, and that answer is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because behind that white robe, behind the open-air addresses and global pilgrimages, another figure operates in silence, one with no camera crews, no cheering crowds, no ceremonial throne. The superior general of the Society of Jesus does not seek visibility. He seeks alignment. And in many moments throughout church history, when crises have struck or decisions had to be made quickly, it was not the Pope who acted first. It was the Jesuits, and not because they defied the Vatican, but because they often anticipated its needs before the Vatican itself did. The question, then, is not whether the Pope is supreme. It is whether he is ever truly alone in his rule, because when the spotlight turns away, the real work continues, and often it is the Jesuits, under orders from the Black Pope, who are already in motion. There are historical precedents for this. Times when the Vatican was fractured, overwhelmed, or uncertain, and the Society of Jesus stepped in with structure, intelligence, and coordination. Popes have leaned heavily on Jesuit advisors, not because of favoritism, but because the order was uniquely trained to navigate complexity. They understood culture. They understood politics. They understood how to read a situation not just theologically, but tactically. And because of their vow of obedience, Jesuits were considered safe instruments of the Church's will. But what happens when the Church's will and the Jesuit mission are not in perfect alignment? That's where things become unclear. Because the Jesuits are not just loyal to Catholic doctrine. They are loyal to the command structure of their own order, and at the top of that structure is not the Pope, it is the superior general. That distinction, subtle as it may seem, changes everything. It means that in certain moments, especially in moments of institutional uncertainty. The Black Pope holds practical authority that even the Pope cannot easily match. It has happened more than once. During periods of theological debate, political upheaval, or papal transition, the Jesuits have provided not only continuity but direction. Their reach is such that they can respond globally, instantly, without needing to assemble councils or consult hierarchies. The Pope may speak to the world, but the Jesuits are often already shaping it, in classrooms, in diplomatic back channels, in the moral reasoning of courts and governments. And the man orchestrating this reach is not a celebrity. He is a strategist. The Black Pope does not oppose the Pope. That is the mistake many make. His power is not in confrontation. It is in complement, so efficient and so entrenched that at times it becomes difficult to tell where papal authority ends and Jesuit influence begins. And that is the mark of a true power structure. Not one that declares itself, but one that becomes part of the very system others rely on to govern. In the quiet corridors of the Vatican, this truth has always been known, even if it is rarely spoken aloud. Long before global communication became instant, the Jesuits had already mastered a different kind of connection, a human network that spanned continents. They did not need satellites or fiber optics. They built their grid through language, loyalty, and education. From the moment the Society of Jesus was founded, its members were sent out, not in waves but in precise deployments. A scholar here, a preacher there, a cultural translator embedded in a royal court or a frontier outpost. Within a century of their founding, Jesuits had become the first truly global religious order, with coordinated missions across Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Europe. And yet, every one of those missions reported back to a central point, the office of the Superior General in Rome. This was not a loose collection of missionaries. It was an international framework of strategy. Each location, no matter how remote, was part of something larger. And the man holding that entire structure together, anticipating challenges, deploying reinforcements, revising tactics, was the Black Pope. The genius of the Jesuit network was not just in its size, but in its subtlety. It didn't look like an empire. It didn't require colonial flags or military garrisons. Instead, it wove itself into existing cultures and institutions, schools, hospitals, scientific societies, diplomatic missions. Jesuits adapted themselves to local customs, even dressing like Confucian scholars in China or learning the intricate languages of Native American tribes. But no matter how deep their integration, their allegiance remained the same. They were never just men of their region, they were agents of the society, and that meant they were connected to one another, regardless of distance, by a shared method and a shared mission. Over time, this method became invisible. To the outside world, a Jesuit might appear to be a solitary teacher or priest, but behind him was a chain of communication, consultation, and command that reached all the way back to Rome, and beyond that, to every other Jesuit in every other region. Even today, that grid remains operational. It is less visible than it once was, but no less real. Jesuits still report in, they still consult with their superiors, and their superiors still gather and relay information to the general. It is a structure built on mutual trust and reinforced by ritual, culture, and discipline. While political institutions rise and fall with elections and scandals, the Jesuit network persists, quiet, stable, and globally present. In a world that often scrambles to react to sudden change, the Society of Jesus already has its feelers extended, its representatives on the ground, its systems in motion. And what makes this structure so durable is that it isn't centralized by force. It is coordinated by loyalty to the vision, the tradition, and above all, to the general who guides it. No matter how modern the world becomes, the Jesuits continue to operate as a unified intelligence, a network without borders, and a system with a single silent voice at its center. The voice of the Black Pope. Obedience is not a fashionable word. In a modern world obsessed with autonomy and individual expression, obedience feels like an artifact of another age, something outdated, even dangerous. But within the Society of Jesus, obedience is not just a virtue, it is the spine of the order. Jesuit priests do not merely follow rules. They take a specific vow of obedience to the Pope and, even more directly, to the superior general. And this vow is not poetic. It is operational. It binds them to the will of a man they may never meet, whose directives may come without context or explanation, and yet they follow. Not because they are naive, but because they have been trained to understand that the mission of the society depends on perfect cohesion. In war, the chain of command must be unbroken. The Jesuits, though dressed in black robes and carrying books instead of weapons, operate under the same principle. Their vow of obedience is the reason the Black Pope's words carry global force, even when spoken softly, even when spoken only once. This vow is unique. Most Catholic religious orders take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but the Jesuits take theirs further. It is not a general commitment to the Church. It is a direct, personal pledge to the general. He does not rule through fear or charisma. He rules through the machinery of trust, trust that has been cultivated, refined, and reinforced through years of formation. A Jesuit's training is not just intellectual. It is psychological. It prepares him to act without hesitation, to accept assignments without argument, and to place the mission above personal interest or comfort. This level of obedience is rare in the modern world. It can be difficult to understand, even for those inside the Church. But to the Jesuits, it is not a burden. It is liberation. The surrender of the self allows them to serve with total focus. And it is this inner discipline, this willingness to vanish into the task, that makes the order so enduring and so powerful. Outside observers sometimes misinterpret this structure. They assume that any system of absolute obedience must be oppressive, but the Jesuits do not see it that way. They see it as alignment, the alignment of intellect, spirit, and purpose towards something greater than themselves. And that alignment is what gives the Black Pope his reach. He does not need to issue threats or offer incentives. He speaks, and the order responds. Not because they are forced to, but because the system is built for response. From the outside, it looks like a miracle. Hundreds of missions moving in sync across the globe. But from within, it is simply structure. A Jesuit does not wonder whether he should go. He prepares to go. He does not ask why the assignment is his. He trusts that the general sees a map he cannot, and in that trust, the society moves with unity rare even in military institutions. This is not a chain of command built on rank. It is built on a sacred vow. The kind of vow that still moves mountains in silence. And the man at the end of that vow, holding it all together, is the Black Pope. Not all orders come in writing. Within the Society of Jesus, communication often takes a more subtle form. Oral tradition, coded phrasing, carefully worded letters. But in some instances, particularly when discretion is paramount, the message may come in ways few recognize, embedded within an ordinary report, layered into correspondence, or even passed verbally through trusted intermediaries. These are not spy novels. They are real, well-documented methods of strategic communication that the Jesuits have honed over centuries. It is not because they have something illegal to hide. It is because their work often unfolds in regions or contexts where visibility is risk. And in such situations, discretion becomes a tool of survival. Some of the society's most sensitive operations, whether educational, diplomatic, or spiritual, have relied not on encrypted technology, but on human intelligence, on well-trained minds who know how to deliver orders, respond to ambiguity, and act with quiet precision. The phrase may be delivered simply, "Proceed as discussed," or "The superior general is aware." And with that, a chain reaction begins. No further explanation needed. The use of indirect communication is not new to the Church, nor is it unique to the Jesuits. But what sets the society apart is how consistently and globally it can deploy this method. Because every Jesuit shares the same formation, the same mental framework. They understand not just the message, but the tone. A brief note from a provincial can carry layers of meaning, understood only by someone who has been shaped by the same spiritual exercises, the same language of mission, discretion, and obedience. This is what makes the order so effective at managing complexity without noise. Instructions are carried in silence. Adjustments are made without memo or meeting. And at the center of it all, the superior general receives these updates not as headlines, but as quiet signals. A letter from Africa, a coded summary from Latin America, a strategic concern noted in a report from Eastern Europe. He reads not just the content, but the current beneath it. He listens for tone, he looks for patterns, and from that web of nuance, he discerns what to move, what to pause, and what to let unfold on its own. This system of subtle command allows the society to act when others are still talking, while bishops gather to debate, while politicians deliver speeches. The Jesuits are already adapting. They do not need to call attention to themselves. In fact, that would compromise the very structure that gives them influence. Their strength lies in their ability to move quietly, to know when to shift tone in a university lecture, when to reinforce presence in a diplomatic crisis, when to retreat from a region that's becoming hostile. And all of these decisions flow upward and downward through a network that speaks without needing to say much at all. This is not bureaucracy, it is choreography. And the one calling the rhythm, even when his voice is never heard outside those walls, is the Black Pope, the unseen conductor of a system whose true genius is that it almost never reveals itself. Within the Vatican, power rarely explodes. It simmers. Institutions operate with centuries of memory, and change happens not with revolutions, but with careful maneuvers and slow tides. Yet beneath the polished floors and holy rituals, a quiet conflict has persisted for generations. It is not open warfare, but it is no less real. This is the silent tension between the traditional hierarchy of the Catholic Church, the cardinals, bishops, and curial offices, and the Society of Jesus. To the world, they may appear united in purpose, but inside those ancient halls there has always been an unspoken rivalry. The Church represents tradition, order, and visibility. The Jesuits, on the other hand, represent adaptability, intellect, and strategic silence. And when those worlds intersect, the result is often a struggle for influence. While the Pope makes proclamations from the throne of St. Peter, the Jesuits are often several steps ahead, drafting ideas, shaping educational narratives, or placing their members in positions of influence long before debates reach the public eye. There have been moments when this tension spilled into view. Bishops have complained of Jesuit interference in local dioceses. Curial officials have bristled at the society's autonomy, its refusal to submit to the same bureaucratic rhythms as the rest of the Church. And behind much of this friction is a simple fact. Jesuits do not wait for approval. Their chain of command is internal, and their allegiance flows upward to one man, not to the College of Cardinals, but to the Superior General. This creates a structure parallel to the Vatican's, not opposed to it, but independent from it in ways that make some uneasy. When cardinals argue over a doctrinal issue, the Jesuits are already teaching a reframed version of that doctrine in their schools. When the Vatican considers a new mission strategy, the Jesuits have already embedded themselves in the culture, built relationships, and begun to act. It is not rebellion, it is momentum. And momentum, when misunderstood, looks a lot like threat. Some popes have embraced this. They've recognized the value of having an order that moves quickly, thinks deeply, and adapts without permission. Others have seen it as a problem, a structure too strong, too centralized, too opaque. There are stories of papal advisors quietly suggesting that the Jesuits be restrained, their autonomy reined in, their influence curbed. But those efforts rarely succeed, because by the time a concern reaches the Pope's desk, the Jesuits have already shaped the conversation elsewhere, through books, through education, through whispered alliances. The war between the Vatican and the Jesuits is not a war of swords or laws. It is a war of timing and message. And the reason the society often wins is that they never announce their moves. They act, they publish, they guide. And they do so under the disciplined leadership of a man whose name rarely reaches the pulpit, but whose reach shapes the minds that stand in it. That man is the Black Pope, and while others wait for permission to speak, he speaks through the silence of results. In the year 1773, something extraordinary happened. A decree was issued by Pope Clement XIV that stunned the Catholic world: the complete suppression and dissolution of the Society of Jesus. With a stroke of the pen, the Jesuits, who had become one of the most powerful religious orders in history, were disbanded. Their missions halted, their schools closed, their members scattered. It was a moment that seemed to confirm the worst fears of their critics. Too powerful, too secretive, too independent. The Pope's bull, Dominus ac Redemptor, declared that the Jesuits had disturbed the peace of the Church, citing controversies, complaints, and unrest that had followed them across kingdoms. But behind the formal language was a deeper story, a political struggle, a pressure campaign by monarchies and secular leaders who had long viewed the Jesuits as dangerous. Spain, Portugal, France, each had expelled the society within their borders in the years prior, and under their pressure, the Vatican finally yielded. It was one of the rare times the Church turned against its own elite force, and it seemed, at least for a moment, like the Black Pope had been defeated. But history would prove otherwise. The Jesuits did not disappear. They adapted. Many went underground, changing robes, adopting new roles in dioceses, or quietly continuing their work in exile. Their libraries were hidden, their records preserved, their networks, while fractured, were not destroyed. And most important of all, their memory remained intact. The formation they had instilled in generations of thinkers, politicians, and priests could not be dissolved by decree. Ideas planted decades earlier continued to grow, even without the visible hand of the society to guide them. The Jesuits had long understood that real power does not reside in offices or titles, but in formation, in the shaping of minds. And because of this, the Black Pope, whoever he was at the time, never truly lost his influence. His network went quiet, but not dormant. The roots remained. In 1814, just 41 years after the suppression, Pope Pius VII officially restored the Society of Jesus. The political winds had shifted. Enlightenment ideas were sweeping Europe. The Church needed intellectual warriors again, men who could counter the rise of secularism not with force, but with reason. And so the Jesuits returned, not humbled, refined, sharpened by exile, more cautious, more strategic, but no less committed. And at their head once again stood the superior general, the Black Pope, ready to resume command. While the world watches the pageantry of religious life, the true design is unfolding in quieter rooms. No headlines, no blessings from balconies, only the whisper of directives sent out like ripples from a still pond. And at the center of that stillness, the Black Pope, not hidden by accident, but by design. The idea of influence often conjures images of loud debates, powerful speeches, and grand gestures. But the Jesuits, and particularly their superior general, understand that the deepest influence moves silently. In the centuries since their founding, Jesuits have become masterful in shaping the frameworks within which decisions are made, not by forcing conclusions, but by shaping the questions that are asked. This is the true genius of their method. While others pursue power by taking control of institutions or thrones, Jesuits enter the systems beneath those powers. They become the confessors of kings, the tutors of princes, the architects of curricula. And so influence flows not through domination, but through design. The Black Pope, in his silent command, understands that the most effective pressure is never noticed. It is simply felt, accepted, and eventually internalized by those in charge, as if the idea had always been theirs. This method of influence has extended far beyond the Church. Across the last 2 centuries, many of the world's most powerful political, academic, and financial leaders were educated in Jesuit institutions. These men and women were not indoctrinated with rigid dogma. They were trained to think critically, to analyze, to seek the balance between conviction and compromise. But this intellectual sharpening always came with something else, a silent thread, a moral core embedded in the structure of Jesuit pedagogy. Whether a student was Catholic or not, believer or skeptic, the education carried an imprint, a way of seeing the world through the lens of disciplined compassion and strategic responsibility, and that lens, once accepted, rarely fades. The Black Pope never needs to send orders to these alumni. He doesn't have to. The system has already done its work. This is why the Jesuits and their general are often viewed with suspicion by secular governments, not because they wield swords or ballots, but because their fingerprints appear where control seems most fragile, in the hearts of young minds, in the conscience of rising leaders, in the values that slowly guide policies over years and decades. You won't find the general's name in a treaty or his signature on a global accord. But look closer, and you may find that the person who drafted those documents, or whispered into the ear of someone who did, once sat in a Jesuit classroom. That is the brilliance of distributed power. It requires no formal office, no official title. It simply embeds itself in culture, in memory, in the shape of ambition. The Black Pope doesn't control the world, but he has spent centuries training those who do, and in doing so, he has proven that real influence is not about claiming credit. It's about making sure the world bends, quietly, in the direction you've already chosen. In the grand theater of history, the Jesuits have rarely taken center stage, but they've always been present just off stage, guiding the narrative with subtle, deliberate movements. Their presence in moments of global transition is not coincidence. From the fall of monarchies to the rise of republics, from colonial expansion to revolutionary thought, Jesuit minds were often nearby, advising, translating, witnessing, sometimes redirecting. And at the heart of this quiet presence was the superior general, the man who understood that history is not always written by those in charge, but by those who understand how ideas move. He did not need armies, only alignment. He did not need a flag, only fidelity. And through that fidelity, the Society of Jesus embedded itself in moments that shaped the very architecture of the modern world. Consider the rise of nationalism in the 19th century. As European empires stretched across continents, the Jesuits were already there, not as conquerors, but as observers and advisors. They were fluent in local languages, immersed in regional histories, and attuned to the shifting emotional landscapes of empires. They ran schools in British India, seminaries in South America, and missions deep within Qing China. When colonial powers sought control, they brought soldiers. But when they needed understanding, they often turned to the Jesuits, men who had already mapped the emotional and intellectual terrain of those lands. Behind many diplomatic reports, many confidential notes passed between capitals, were the calm, analytical summaries drafted by Jesuit scholars. They did not dictate foreign policy, but they informed it, and in doing so, they helped shape a world order without ever taking credit. The Superior General, reviewing these reports from his unadorned desk in Rome, played the long game. He didn't react to every political wave. He read the tides. When revolutions erupted in Latin America, when anti-clerical regimes gained power in Europe, when new ideologies began to question the very idea of God, the Jesuits adapted. They retreated when necessary, resurfaced when possible, and always maintained a thread of continuity, not in buildings or borders, but in thought, in the philosophy passed from one generation of Jesuits to the next, unbroken. That continuity became its own kind of power, unshakable because it didn't rely on visibility. It is no accident that world leaders from so many countries share a Jesuit education, nor is it an accident that many of them hold similar values, a belief in disciplined thought, a cautious approach to power, a respect for the invisible structures that shape society. These are not always conscious echoes of the Society's teachings, but they are echoes all the same, and the man who orchestrates this web of subtle continuity, who reads the shifting landscape of global power and decides where to plant seeds that may not bloom for decades, is the Black Pope. He does not need history to remember him. He only needs the future to quietly follow the trail he's left behind. There are rooms inside the Curia Generalizia that few have ever entered, not because they are locked, but because their importance is not marked by ornate doors or Vatican seals. These rooms hold archives, not of political treaties or royal decrees, but of correspondence between Jesuits who lived and died in obscurity, their names forgotten, but their missions remembered. Letters from missionaries in 18th century Ethiopia, reports from scholars teaching physics in a Japanese seminary, handwritten reflections from a priest embedded in a Cold War negotiation. Each one is a fragment in a mosaic that spans continents and centuries, and overseeing that mosaic is the superior general, the one man whose responsibility is not just to manage the present, but to understand how every quiet piece of the past fits into a larger pattern. He is not a collector of stories. He is the keeper of continuity. This continuity does not serve nostalgia, it serves foresight. The archives are not just records, they are a living map of how influence travels through time, slowly, indirectly, but persistently. A mission that failed in 1704 may have laid the intellectual groundwork for a university founded in 1830. A letter describing tension in a remote village might resurface decades later as context for a diplomatic crisis. The general reads not just what is said, but what is implied, what is unresolved, what must be remembered so that when the moment returns, the society will not be caught unaware. This is strategic memory, and it is one of the most powerful tools in the Jesuit arsenal. Other organizations build empires through domination. The Jesuits build theirs through memory, organized, preserved, and deployed with care. The general does not read every document, but he establishes the system by which information is gathered, categorized, and shared. He knows which voices to listen for and which patterns to follow. His is not a power of surveillance, but of discernment. He does not act because something has happened. He acts because he recognizes that something is about to. And that recognition is born from the long discipline of understanding the flow of time, not just in days and years, but in the rhythm of cultures, in the evolution of faith, in the quiet rise and fall of influence. He moves accordingly, silently, strategically. To outsiders, the archives may seem like a collection of old papers. To the general, they are proof that nothing is ever truly lost, that every whispered doubt, every quiet success, every buried struggle has the potential to inform the present. The Black Pope does not need armies. He needs memory. Because in a world obsessed with the instant, he commands something far more powerful, the accumulated insight of centuries. There is a silence that surrounds the name of the Black Pope, a silence not born of ignorance, but of reverence, of caution, and sometimes of fear. He is not a villain nor a saint. He does not exist to be praised or condemned. He exists to guide, to calculate and to preserve a certain kind of stability beneath the chaos of the visible church. For many within the Catholic hierarchy, his role is both a reassurance and a riddle. His decisions rarely provoke open rebellion, not because everyone agrees with him, but because most never fully grasp the scope of what he's doing. His influence is diffuse. It is like gravity, never seen directly, but always felt by those who live within its field. This kind of power comes with a cost. The superior general lives in proximity to the Vatican, but not within it. He is trusted by popes, but independent of them. His jurisdiction does not stop at ecclesiastical boundaries. It stretches across education, diplomacy, social justice, and even subtle forms of political alignment. Some popes have leaned on him as a strategist, a stabilizer, even a secret advisor. Others have tried to rein in the society, fearing its independence. But none have ever truly escaped the gravitational pull of the Jesuits, because by the time a crisis reaches the papal desk, the society has likely already assessed it, dispatched men to it, and begun work on a solution. The general's foresight often makes the Vatican feel like it's catching up, not because it is slow, but because the Jesuit mind is trained to move in longer arcs. Publicly, the relationship between the Pope and the superior general is one of mutual respect. Privately, it can be more complicated. The Pope is the spiritual head of a global religion, tasked with guiding billions. The Black Pope is the strategic head of a smaller, more agile force, tasked with anticipating what will challenge that religion next. The tension between those roles is subtle, but ever-present. It is not rivalry. It is a difference in altitude. One man leads the flock. The other scouts the terrain beyond the horizon. The Church needs both to survive, but they do not always walk side by side. And so the Black Pope remains what he has always been, a presence behind the curtain, a voice in the margins, a figure whose name is known, but whose actions are rarely traced. The world may see white robes and hear papal blessings, but somewhere nearby, in a modest room surrounded by maps, letters, and silence, the Black Pope reads, listens, and prepares. He does not need recognition. His power is in his invisibility, in the knowledge that sometimes the most faithful service is the one no one ever sees. Every organization carries within it the seeds of contradiction, and the Society of Jesus is no exception. Founded in the spirit of obedience and devotion, it has also produced some of the most fiercely independent minds the Church has ever seen. Jesuit thinkers have stood at the vanguard of science, philosophy, education, and moral theology. Some have written books that challenged Vatican orthodoxy. Others have negotiated with regimes that the Church refused to acknowledge. And yet, through all these tensions, the society has remained intact, a living paradox of strict hierarchy and intellectual boldness. At the heart of that paradox is the superior general, who must hold together the contradictions without extinguishing them. He does not issue dogma, he curates freedom, and in doing so, he cultivates one of the most complex webs of influence in the modern world. This balancing act is delicate. On one side, the society must remain loyal to the Church, obedient in structure, deferential in public. On the other, it must fulfill its mission, which often requires confronting the uncomfortable truths the Church cannot address directly. A Jesuit priest may teach liberation theology in Latin America, challenging both capitalism and ecclesiastical conservatism. Another may run a school for Muslim students in a region where Christianity is forbidden. Another still may work in clandestine negotiations between warring governments. These are not rogue agents. They are deployed, observed, and guided by a central authority, the superior general. His leadership is not about imposing uniformity. It is about orchestrating a symphony of risks. To outsiders, this can look like inconsistency. To the society, it is adaptability, the very thing that has kept them alive through centuries of upheaval. And the general, more than anyone, understands the price of that adaptability. He knows that his men will walk into danger, will push boundaries, will sometimes fail spectacularly. But he also knows that their daring is necessary. The world changes too quickly for a rigid church. The Jesuits must be the scouts, the experimenters, the thinkers who take the first steps into moral and intellectual wilderness. And for that to happen, the general must be both commander and guardian, never micromanaging, but never unaware. This is the part of his role least understood by the public. The Black Pope is not just a strategist. He is a steward of freedom, one who must ensure that the society's boldness does not become arrogance, that its innovations do not mutate into betrayal. His leadership is tested not by how many follow orders, but by how many follow their conscience within the structure he maintains. The society's greatest strength lies not in its unity, but in its tension, and only a leader with extraordinary discipline can keep that tension from tearing the order apart. That is the true mystery of the Black Pope, not that he commands silently, but that he governs a storm without extinguishing its fire. In an age where information floods every screen and opinion is mistaken for truth, the idea of a leader who chooses to remain unseen feels almost alien. And yet the superior general, the Black Pope, has mastered the art of deliberate invisibility. It is not shyness, nor humility, it is strategy. When the world moves in noise, he moves in quiet. When institutions shout their relevance from platforms, he retreats into discretion. He knows that attention invites distortion. And for someone tasked with steering a global network that spans education, diplomacy, and spirituality, clarity is too precious to risk. So he remains off camera, off stage, working through intermediaries and institutions, never allowing the spotlight to obscure his purpose. The power of silence, after all, is not that it conceals, it sharpens. This silence is not passive, It is active and deeply cultivated. The general does not isolate himself out of fear or detachment. He listens constantly. Jesuits on the ground send him information that is raw and unfiltered. Reports from refugee camps, conversations with tribal leaders, insights from students and soldiers alike. The world that reaches the general is not the sanitized version found in press briefings or polished reports. It is dense, emotional, and often contradictory, and it is from this flood of tension and complexity that he must extract clarity. His job is not to solve every problem. It is to understand the patterns, where the world is heading, where the church is faltering, where new seeds must be planted. There is a wisdom in knowing that not all power must be claimed aloud. The Black Pope does not attend global summits. He does not give TED Talks or write best-selling memoirs, and yet his words shape policy in countries he has never visited. His recommendations shift the mission of universities in languages he does not speak. His decisions affect thousands, priests, students, community leaders, all moving along threads of loyalty that stretch back centuries. And unlike the visible church, with its rituals and declarations, the general's influence requires no ceremony. It happens in brief meetings, in quiet letters, in decisions that ripple outward without needing attribution. He is a man whose legacy is not written in marble, but embedded in motion. For the world accustomed to public power, this model can be unsettling. It raises questions about accountability, transparency, control. But the Jesuits do not operate like governments. They are not elected. They are not designed to please. They are designed to endure. And endurance, the Black Pope knows, requires a special kind of strength. The strength to resist applause, to work in silence, and to lead without ever needing to be seen. To understand the real reach of the Jesuit superior general, one must first step away from the churches and cathedrals, and instead walk into a classroom. Not the grand lecture halls of Rome, but modest schools scattered across the world. In slums, refugee camps, isolated villages, or the quieter corners of wealthy cities. These are Jesuit institutions, and though their architecture may vary wildly, the mission remains the same. Education not merely as instruction, but as formation. This has always been the quiet weapon of the Jesuit Order. To shape the mind is to shape the future. And no one has wielded that weapon more skillfully than the Black Pope, who oversees the largest network of Catholic education in the world, and possibly the most influential educational system on earth. Jesuit schools do not advertise an ideology. They teach science, literature, economics, philosophy, not indoctrination. But the method, the discipline, and the worldview that emerges from Jesuit pedagogy are unmistakable. Students are trained to think deeply, argue respectfully, and seek justice. They are taught to examine their privilege, confront injustice, and weigh responsibility above reward. This formation reaches beyond the classroom. It shapes the character of future judges, presidents, diplomats, and entrepreneurs. And behind the curriculum, behind the values embedded in these lessons, is a chain of authority that ultimately leads to one man, the superior general. He does not write the textbooks or grade the exams, but his vision determines the moral and intellectual architecture of these schools. His influence passes through generations, not by force, but by design. In some nations, Jesuit schools are the only institutions where critical thinking is nurtured without fear of reprisal. In others, they quietly mold the elite, producing graduates who go on to hold vast influence across finance, governance, and media. It is this duality of serving both the marginalized and the powerful that gives the society its unique grip on the fabric of modern society, and it is why the general is not merely a religious figure. He is a global strategist, one who understands that true power is not about governing people's actions, but guiding the way they learn to see the world. When a child walks into a Jesuit classroom, they may not know the name of the man who approved the curriculum or shaped the school's mission. But decades later, when that child becomes a policymaker or a journalist or a spiritual leader, the imprint remains. It guides decisions made in boardrooms and courtrooms, in campaigns and confessionals. And the Black Pope, watching quietly from his position just beyond the spotlight, knows that his greatest victories are not celebrated in headlines. They are whispered in the ways people lead, with conscience, with clarity, and often without even knowing where those instincts were first planted. Among the many tools at the Superior General's disposal, perhaps the most quietly powerful is time. Not the ticking of clocks or the turn of a calendar, but historical time, the deep rhythm of centuries, the long arc of transformation. While governments and companies plan in years or quarters, the Jesuits think in generations. This is not an accident. It is doctrine. The superior general is not only responsible for the present health of the Society of Jesus. He is charged with preparing it for the world yet to come. He is trained to anticipate futures that do not yet exist and to plant roots in places that seem, for the moment, irrelevant. To the outside world, this can look like wandering, but to the society it is cultivation. And this way of thinking makes the Black Pope unlike any other leader in the Church or beyond it. He knows, for example, that an investment in a small school today may yield influence 50 years later in a country that has not yet risen to global significance. He knows that a relationship with a local chief or village priest may eventually become a key to dialogue when regimes shift or crises unfold. Most importantly, he understands that failure is part of the process. Not every mission bears fruit. Not every experiment succeeds. But Jesuit history teaches that the seeds must still be sown, because even when the initial purpose is forgotten, the structures remain. Libraries, ideas, habits of thought, ready to serve when history changes course. The general's job is not to harvest, it is to prepare the soil. This long-view approach makes the Society of Jesus resilient in a way few institutions can match. While others crumble under political pressure or internal scandal, the Jesuits adapt. They shift focus, reassign personnel, rebuild trust. The Superior General orchestrates this quietly, drawing on a network of reports, assessments, and spiritual discernment that allows him to move without alarm. He rarely acts dramatically, but when he does, it is almost always with a sense that the moment has been anticipated long before. He sees history not as something that happens to the society, but as something the society must help guide. That guidance is subtle. It does not declare itself in press conferences or global summits. It appears in the gentle persistence of values, the continued presence of Jesuit voices in education, diplomacy, and ethics. It lives in the way the society endures, not because it resists change, but because it integrates change without losing identity. That is the paradox of Jesuit leadership, to be both ancient and adaptive, both grounded and visionary. And the Black Pope, watching quietly from behind layers of time and tradition, remains the steward of that paradox. While others rush to shape the moment, he prepares to shape the century. The Society of Jesus has never been a monolith. From the moment of its founding, it attracted men from wildly different regions, backgrounds, and temperaments. Soldiers and scholars, poets and mathematicians, mystics and realists. Over the centuries, this diversity became not a liability but a signature strength. Jesuits do not conform to a single mold. They are trained to read their environment, speak the language of the people they serve, and adapt the mission without compromising the spirit. This makes the order uniquely fluid, and it makes the role of the Superior General incredibly complex. He must lead an institution that thrives on difference without allowing that difference to spiral into disunity. His authority must be flexible but unbreakable. In this, the Black Pope becomes less a commander and more a conductor, guiding many voices into harmony without muting their individuality. To maintain that balance, the general must rely on a spiritual discipline as rigorous as his administrative acumen. Every Jesuit is expected to undergo deep internal formation, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola, a method of meditation and discernment that trains the individual to distinguish between ego and mission, fear and faith. But even among men trained in self-examination, ambition and conflict inevitably arise. The Black Pope is the final arbiter. He is not merely a manager of tasks, but a keeper of conscience. He reviews the tensions that flare between provinces, between generations, between reformers and traditionalists, and he must decide when to intervene, when to allow struggle, and when to remind the order of its shared vows. His authority is not imposed. It is accepted because it has been earned, through listening, through consistency, and through the quiet gravity of a man who embodies the mission he protects. This gravity is rarely visible. The Superior General is not meant to be charismatic in the public sense. He is meant to be centered, a man whose presence draws clarity from complexity. Jesuits are trained to move into fractured spaces and uncertain cultures. They face moral ambiguity, political danger, and spiritual exhaustion. The general, through his letters, guidance, and decisions, must be a source of clarity without rigidity. He cannot dictate solutions to problems he does not fully inhabit, but he can set the tone. He can remind the order again and again that obedience does not mean surrendering the mind. It means aligning one's mind with something greater than the self. In a world that praises individualism and speed, the Black Pope represents a strange and ancient kind of power, one rooted in patience, mutual trust, and disciplined reflection. His strength does not lie in charisma or control, but in a deeper authority. The authority to listen, to discern, and to unify without erasing. It is this quiet capacity that has held the society together through civil wars, exiles, and centuries of transformation. And it is what continues to make the Black Pope not only a mystery, but a model of leadership few can match. Power in the Vatican is often imagined as ceremonial, a matter of robes, incense, public blessings, and ancient liturgy. But beneath those rituals lies a quieter, more complex machine. It is a machine of administration, diplomacy, education, and global logistics. The tale of the Black Pope is not merely a chronicle of an office or a man. It is a mirror. It reflects how power is exercised without a claim, how truth can be shaped without announcement, how systems of belief evolve under guidance few ever recognize. For centuries, the superior general of the Jesuits has remained hidden from the public eye, yet present in the most critical decisions of empires, councils, and cultures. His influence has outlasted kings and regimes, not because it was aggressive, but because it was adaptive. A shadow always one step ahead of the light. What makes this figure so haunting is not what he does, but what he reveals. In a world obsessed with titles, images, and spectacle, the Black Pope reminds us that the most effective authority rarely needs to declare itself. While presidents govern with policies and popes lead with blessings, the superior general governs with questions planted deep in the minds of those trained to think, lead, and listen. He doesn't rely on loyalty enforced by fear, but on a formation that shapes generations. Jesuit influence does not announce itself in campaign speeches or televised ceremonies. It appears years later in how a diplomat negotiates peace, in how a teacher inspires conscience, in how a young leader dares to ask why. The Vatican remains one of the smallest nations on earth, and yet its reach is global, not just through the visible seat of Peter, but through the invisible architecture of intellect and influence constructed by the Jesuits. The Black Pope does not claim the authority of Peter. He claims something else: the ability to guide those who guide others. And in this hidden hierarchy, he holds the pulse of a network unlike any other. Not a kingdom, but a culture. Not a regime, but a rhythm. The kind of power that rewrites futures quietly, deliberately, and with an almost sacred patience. So when people ask, who really controls the Vatican? The answer may never be certain. But if you listen closely, not to what's said in the square, but to what is taught in distant classrooms, to what is whispered in the halls of diplomacy, to what is carried within the hearts of those who serve without ever being seen, you might begin to hear the echo of that hidden voice, the voice of a man with no throne, no crown, and yet a reach that touches the world. That is the enduring mystery of the Black Pope.